Welcome to another of my true crime tales, and for this video we're going to head to the south side of the River Thames and make our way to the district of Lambeth. The scene of this crime was a narrow passage by the name of Salamanca Place, a throughway that still exists just off Black Prince Road, albeit it bears little resemblance to what the Echo informed its readers was a cross alley. There are no houses in this shortcut from one thoroughfare to another, and being very badly lit at night, it has a very undesirable appearance. Black Prince Road was then called Broad Street, and the area around it was mostly made up of industrial premises and manufacturers, many of which had kilns, the fires of which were kept burning 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. One of the most prominent of these manufacturers was Doulton and Company, pottery and china makers, whose magnificent headquarters dominated, and still dominates, the first section on the left side of Black Prince Road, or Broad Street as it then was. Doulton did in fact have several premises dotted around the immediate vicinity, and it is with the factory that backed onto Salamanca Place that our story is concerned. The company had, as it happens, received royal recognition in 1901, when Edward VII had granted them a royal warrant, albeit the press appear not to have picked up on this fact, as throughout the reporting on the case the premises were always referred to as those of Messrs. Doulton and Company. In 1956, Royal Doulton moved elsewhere, and their various premises were demolished, leaving just their decorative terracotta former headquarters standing. Today that building is known as the China Works, and Salamanca Place opposite is now lined by gleaming modern structures of glass and steel, and there is nothing here to remember the victim of a long-ago murder whose remains were discovered in a gateway on this sordid little thoroughfare just over 123 years ago. So let's venture back in time to arrive in the district of Lambeth in the early hours of Sunday the 8th of June, 1902. At just before 4 o'clock that morning, Charles Whiting and Robert Munzer, potter's labourers who were working the night shift at Doulton's, set out from the company's headquarters on Broad Street, heading for a satellite premises on Salamanca Place, intending to fire up one of the kilns. Crossing Broad Street, they made their way along Salamanca Place, and as they approached the first of the two gates into the pot bank, Charles Whiting noticed a heap on the ground that he at first took to be the result of a butcher's clear-out. However, taking a closer look at what the Daily Express described as the heap of ghastliness, he noticed what appeared to be a human skull among the bones. Closer examination, the Express continued, revealed the trunk and the dismembered limbs, arms and legs carefully placed side by side, but hands and feet missing. Whiting later stated that he got the impression that the pieces had been placed there carefully. The body was really in 3 pieces, the South London Chronicle reported. First came the legs, then the lower part of the body, and the head was in the pelvis. Whiting's workmate, Robert Munzer, was of a different opinion, later saying that it seemed to him as though the remains had been shot out of a sack. Munzer proceeded to turn the head over with his boot, and he saw a small ear, leading him to ascertain that the remains were those of a woman. The two men hurried to the next gate and alerted the night watchman, Jack Cox, to their find. According to the Weekly Dispatch, Cox went with them to the gateway, and on beholding the awful sight, he told the two men to return to their work, while he raised the alarm and went for a policeman. Heading up to the Albert Embankment, Cox found Police Constable James Birtle and tried to tell him of the dreadful find. He was, however, so unnerved and agitated by what he had seen that he could scarcely make himself understood, and could do little more than point in the direction of Salamanca Place and beckon the officer to follow him. Birtle went with him, and turning into Salamanca Place, he was confronted by the awful sight that had rendered Cox speechless. The constable sent immediately for assistance, and soon other officers as well as curious onlookers were arriving at the scene, and the police began the unpleasant task of placing the remains in a box, which was then conveyed to the nearby Lambeth mortuary. At present, the Echo told its readers, there lies in the mortuary the fleshless, hairless, eyeless skull, with its row of glistening teeth grinning on the spectator. A wrinkled, wizened, and terribly burned portion of the trunk, bearing appearances of having been hacked about in a most diabolical manner. There were no hands or feet, but simply a thigh bone and the bones of the lower portion of the leg. There is not a shred of clothing that could act as a clue. At 5:40 that morning, Dr. George Nicol Henry, Divisional Surgeon to the Metropolitan Police's L Division, within whose jurisdiction the remains had been discovered, arrived at the mortuary to carry out a post-mortem examination. He later reported that
the body is that of a young woman of slender build and somewhat short stature, aged between 20 and 30, height about 5 foot, complexion dark, hair straight and very dark, teeth in an excellent state of preservation, prominent cheekbones and upper part of jaw, chin somewhat pointed, giving an angular appearance to the face. Nose was probably turned up.
This description, which was made public in the hope of helping identify the victim, was remarkably detailed given that so little actually remained of her. Indeed, it was further reported that
the examination revealed even more distressing evidences of the gruesome processes resorted to by the perpetrator in order to obliterate identity and hide the original manner of the crime. The head and upper part of the body had been partly boiled, partly baked, and missing limbs have probably been cremated. The skull had been hacked from the trunk, and the body had been sawn to pieces by a rough saw. All the bones were charred, and the flesh shriveled up or stripped. 2 rows of excellent teeth were only marred by the loss of the incisors in the upper jaw, broken off as if the woman had been violently kicked in the mouth before or after death.
There was little doubt that an atrocious murder had taken place, and newspapers on Monday the 9th of June were quick to draw comparisons with the Jack the Ripper atrocities of 1888. Not since the last series of Ripper tragedies in Whitechapel, which took place some 14 years ago, the London Daily Chronicle informed readers, has London been confronted with so horrible a discovery as that which was made early yesterday morning in a narrow and unfrequented alley at the rear of the famous Doulton works on the Albert Embankment. In many of its aspects, another newspaper reported, the murder is not unlike one of the Jack the Ripper crimes which startled London some years ago. Whilst as far as the Morning Leader was concerned, a ghastly and mysterious crime, the main features of which recall the foul days of Jack the Ripper, was discovered at 4 o'clock yesterday morning in Salamanca Place, Lambeth. The proximity of the location where the remains were found to so many industrial and manufacturing premises, coupled with the fact that the body had evidently been burnt at a high temperature, led to the police carrying out inquiries at the various factories in the vicinity. This led to an employee of Doulton, who was in charge of one of the glazing kilns located just inside the gateway where the remains had been found, being taken to the police station and questioned, albeit he was able to give a good account of himself, and was released without charge later that day. Another possible clue was reported by the Morning Leader on Tuesday the 10th of June. It is asserted that a lamplighter named Barton has made a statement to the police to the effect that about 3 o'clock on Sunday morning, when approaching the end of Salamanca Street, he passed a tall man wearing a silk hat and overcoat and carrying a carpet bag of the old-fashioned type, and one such as might easily have contained the remains that were found. The police, however, attached little importance to this. The reaction to the murder from the people of the district was certainly reminiscent of that from the people of the East End to the Whitechapel murders all those years before. In Lambeth Road, the unhappy women with scared faces who usually frequent this district are huddled at street corners, too frightened to trust themselves to traverse the streets alone, the Daily Express reported, continuing, in the neighbourhood all was animation last night, Broad Street and Lambeth High Street being alive with people discussing the gruesome tragedy. Meanwhile, attempts to identify the victim led to some harrowing scenes at the mortuary where, according to the Weekly Dispatch, hysterical women have broken down and swooned at the sight of the remains, which they declared in a most positive manner to be those of a long-lost relative. The article went on to reveal how these attempts to identify the missing woman had resulted in a happy ending for at least one family. One person described the remains as those of her sister, who had been missing for 12 months, and when last seen was known to be living in Lambeth. She gave certain details which tallied with those in possession of the police, and much attention was paid to the woman's statement until the question of the teeth which the missing relative was supposed to have had removed was raised, when it became clear that the dead woman and the relative were two separate persons. As the woman appeared ill, she was taken into a local public house, where she was given some brandy, and whilst partaking of it, she heard a voice in the next compartment, which she recognised as her sister's. She rushed into the bar and to her delight found it was the sister who had been missing, and a reconciliation took place which resulted in the restoration of the woman to her friends. The police were busily attempting to identify both the victim and the perpetrator. Detective Inspector John McCarthy was in charge of the investigation, while second in command was Inspector MacArthur. They had sent officers to conduct extensive house-to-house inquiries within a half-mile radius of where the body had been found, but nothing useful was unearthed. Visits to cab yards, butchers' yards, baking houses, coffee stalls, and the like had yielded the same lack of results. Inspector McCarthy had even gone so far as to sift through the ashes of several of Doulton's kilns, but this too had done nothing to help solve the mystery. Constables, whose beats encompassed the streets and localities that the local prostitutes were known to frequent, were taken to the mortuary and shown the remains in the hope that they might recognise the person they belonged to, but this too came to nothing. In the days following the discovery, there were suggestions in the newspapers that it might not be a case of murder at all, but rather a prank perpetrated by medical students. The proximity of St. Thomas's Hospital to Broad Street was mentioned by several papers, and this led the police to the hospital to seek the opinion of the officials there. Those officials were emphatic that it would be impossible for a student to play such a trick, as a strict regime was to be followed in order to remove anybody from the hospital. It simply could not be done without the knowledge of the treasurer or the secretary, the police were told, and both were adamant that no bodies were unaccounted for. In addition, the police surgeon and several other doctors who had examined the remains were, according to the Derby and Chesterfield Reporter, of the opinion that the work of mutilation had been done in a clumsy manner and most certainly not by anyone acquainted with anatomy or accustomed to dissection. All manner of questions were being posed by the newspapers regarding the victim's identity, why the remains had been left at that particular spot, and who had deposited them. Had they been wheeled there on a perambulator or on a cart? Had they been thrown from a passing train as it went over one of the railway bridges located close to Salamanca Place and Broad Street? One theory was that the murderer had been on his way to dispose of the remains in the river when something or someone had startled him, causing him to discard the grisly cargo sooner than he had intended. Another potential clue was suggested by reports that the remains had been wrapped in a copy of Country Life, several pages of which were found scattered over the pavement in Salamanca Place. But it transpired that a fried fish shop on Broad Street used this and other newspapers to wrap their fish and chips in, and the workmen in the vicinity, once they had eaten their meals, simply threw the wrapping and the fish bones on the ground. The police were also trying to work out exactly when the remains had been dumped. Constable Birtle stated that he had passed the spot where they were found at 3:30 a.m. It was getting light, and he would, he said, have seen the body had it been there at that time. Robert Muntzer told the police that he had seen a man and a woman in the alley at around 10 o'clock on the Saturday night. The woman was about 5 feet tall, he said. She was wearing a white straw hat with, he believed, a black band. He only saw the man's back, but thought he was about a foot taller than the woman. He was wearing a cap and looked like a working man in his best clothes. The couple had, he said, walked into Broad Street. He was adamant that he would recognise them if he saw them going round marketing. When the inquest opened on the afternoon of Wednesday, the 11th of June, with acting coroner Dr. Michael Taylor presiding, the woman had still not been identified, and she was simply referred to as a woman unknown. Dr. Taylor began by telling the jury that the case was one of a very unusual kind, and the great difficulty was that of identification. Charles Whiting and Robert Munson testified to finding the body. Constable Birtle then told how he had been on the embankment at 4:40 in the morning when Charles Whiting had approached him, saying, "Come here, I want you." Whiting, he said, was extremely agitated and couldn't tell him what he wanted until they reached the remains in Salamanca Place. At this point, the coroner recalled Charles Whiting and asked him if this was what had happened. Whiting said that it wasn't. It was Cox, not him, who had fetched the constable from the embankment. Asked to explain the discrepancy, the constable admitted that he did not know whether it was Whiting or Cox that had called him. He was certainly under the impression that it was Whiting, but it might have been somebody else. The final witness that day was Dr. Henry, who, having described the condition of the remains, told the court that they formed part of one and the same body, that of a female. With that, the coroner adjourned the inquest for a week. Although McCarthy and his men continued to make strenuous inquiries, little information that might help solve the mystery was forthcoming. Newspaper reporters were out in force on the streets, trying to elicit any information they could from the locals. A woman who lived in Salamanca Street told a journalist from the Dundee Evening Telegraph that the police rarely ventured into Salamanca Place. After dark, she continued, the lowest class of men and women prowl about the place, and from the screams and oaths I hear almost every night, fighting seems to be going on there continually. I never dare go down there at night. As to attempts to identify the woman, the Telegraph had this to say: among the population hereabouts there are so many irregular lives that, until a face has been missed from its usual haunts for several days, no alarm would be felt. There are several of these reported to have disappeared, but of whose departure no one would dream of speaking to the police. Attention from that quarter is not courted. Notwithstanding the efforts being made to solve the mystery, by the time the inquest resumed on the morning of Wednesday the 18th of June, the victim had still not been identified, and thus she was once again referred to as a woman unknown. The first witness that day was John Cox, the night watchman, who told the court that he had passed through Salamanca Place at just before midnight on the Saturday night, and he was certain the remains were not there then. At 3 a.m., an hour before the discovery, he had come to the gate where the body was found to get a little fresh air, and again there was nothing in the gateway at that time. He recounted how he had heard Whiting shout, "Gate!" at 4 o'clock that morning, but stated that there was no alarm in his voice. When he opened the gate, he recalled Whiting had said, "Jack, here's a head and the remains of a body." Since both Whiting and Munzer seemed frightened, he told them to come into the yard and look after the coals, whilst he went for the police. On his way to the Albert Embankment, he met two youngish gentlemen who looked like students, and he informed them of the discovery. They went with him to the scene and made some remarks which he could not understand. Then one of them said, "It's a female head." They saw him wave his hand towards a policeman, and having said something to each other, they walked away. "In which direction?" asked the coroner. "In the direction of the hospital," Cox replied. Asked to describe the two men, Cox caused much amusement when he pointed to two reporters and said, "Like them, one was tall and the other was short. I'm not saying those were the gentlemen, just that they looked like 'em." "Ah," sighed the coroner, "we are weaving a web around the press." Taylor then turned to the newspaper reporters and assured them that he didn't think the police would need to keep an eye on them. Cox then went on to reveal that once he had taken Constable Birtle to Salamanca Place, he had hurried to the offices of a newspaper where, for a fee, he had told them of the find. "Why didn't you go to the others?" quizzed the coroner. The witness, apparently remembering his fee with satisfaction, the Illustrated Police Budget reported, replied, "If I'd knowed as much as I do now, I should have done." Pointing at the two pressmen to whom Cox had previously alluded, the coroner replied, "But if you identify these gentlemen, as you have done, they will not take your news next time." This last comment was greeted by an outburst of laughter in the court. The next witness was George Henderson, a lamplighter, who said that, having extinguished the lamps in Broad Street at 3:10 a.m., he had passed through Salamanca Place, but had seen nothing. Next to testify was Dr. Henry, who gave a truly harrowing account of what had happened to the body. The People spared its readers none of the gruesome details in its issue of Sunday the 22nd of June. Terrible details came to light on Wednesday at the adjourned inquiry into the death of the woman whose mutilated remains were found at Lambeth 10 days ago. Dr. Henry, the police divisional surgeon, and Professor Pepper have made exhaustive examination of the remains, and the former read their joint report as to their discoveries and the deductions made from them. The doctor's opinion was that much of the dismemberment took place after the body had been boiled. The boiling process would greatly facilitate the dividing of the body. There was charred skin on some of the parts, which appeared to have been roasted. A sentence from Dr. Henry's evidence gives a graphic illustration of the nature of the outrage. "I think the parts in question," said he, "have been subject to moist heat, stripped of most of their flesh, and then roasted. Many parts of the body were wrenched off by main force. The backbone was partly divided by a saw and then broken. The lower parts of the body, said witness, have been removed by an irregular circular sweep around the hips and were then wrenched off. Patches of hair were found above the ears and at the back of the neck. The hair had been roughly cut, and that behind the neck was about 4 inches long. There was blood on it. An ordinary saw and an ordinary knife were used in cutting up the body. The deceased was a woman of 25 to 30 years of age, about 5 feet in height, slim but well developed muscularly. She possessed a low but not a sloping forehead, with brown hair, well-marked eyebrows, and very small ears. Witness had discovered a clot of blood in the nostrils, and from this he thought that death was probably caused by suffocation. Asked by the coroner if this was work done by anybody with anatomical knowledge, Dr. Henry replied, it showed no anatomical knowledge whatever. The results were not those that would come from a post-mortem examination or from operations. The final witness was Inspector McCarthy, who revealed that 7 people had come forward to claim the remains as those of a missing relative. 6 of the people had been traced, while officers from the Criminal Investigation Department were making inquiries in the provinces with regards to the 7th, and he asked for another adjournment in order to give his men time to complete those important inquiries. The coroner duly obliged and adjourned the inquest for 2 weeks. Since the doctors had completed their examinations and photographs had been taken of the remains, the coroner decided that the woman could be laid to rest, and to that end, on Thursday the 19th of June, he issued an order for the unknown female to be buried. And as a female unknown, the Weekly Dispatch commented, the dead woman must remain until justice claims for its own the hand that murdered and mutilated her. On Wednesday the 2nd of July, at the final day of the inquest, Inspector McCarthy testified that the police had continued and extended their inquiries, even going so far as to search all the barges going up and down the river and those lying alongside Lambeth, but they were still no nearer to solving the mystery. The coroner then recalled Dr. Henry and asked him if there was any truth in a press report that one of the women's ears was deformed. The doctor replied that there was no deformity of either of the deceased's ears. One was more shrunken than the other, but that was all. Dr. Taylor then began his summing up and stated that the case was very similar to one at Battersea about 13 years ago, but in that instance, thanks to the careful piecing together of the mutilated remains by Dr. Kempster, the woman was identified. The coroner was here referring to the case of Elizabeth Jackson, whose torso was found in the Thames on the 4th of June 1889. She was the only one of the so-called Thames torso murders victims to have been positively identified. But as far as the woman whose remains were found in Salamanca Place, the coroner concluded, this was a very unsatisfactory case by reason of the want of identification of the deceased, but the matter would still remain in the hands of the police. The jury returned an open verdict that the deceased was found dead and mutilated in Salamanca Place, but how she came by her death there is no evidence to determine. And so the inquest drew to a close, and the unknown woman whose body was found in Salamanca Place joined the extensive list of London's unsolved murders. Who she was, where she came from, who was responsible for her murder were questions that were never answered. Was her murder one of the series known as the Thames Torso murders? Who were the 2 students that Cox found and took to the scene before alerting the police? Were they in some way connected with the body? What do you think? Let me know in the comments section below. I hope that you have found this true crime tale interesting. If you have, please give it a like and be sure to subscribe to my channel. And until we meet again in the dark and mysterious labyrinth of London's true crime underworld, stay safe.